Good morning again. This is the House Appropriations Committee. It is a little bit before 10 a.m. on January 14th, 2025, and we're continuing with more topics. The rest of this morning, we're going to talk about ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act. We're going to get a primer on it from Emily Byrne from the Joint Fiscal Office, and then we're going to hear from Douglas Farnham about money and an update on the spending on that. So we'll start with Emily. Welcome. Everybody. I think we won't go around.
Great. Emily Byrne from the Joint Fiscal Office. Just wait, Aaron's got to let me in the room. And then I have a PowerPoint. I will walk you through it. Copies are at the copy room right now. I will bring them once afterwards. It's probably good to watch and listen as opposed to trying to read simultaneously, right? So I'm going to do a very quick sort of high level, what was ARPA, what happened with ARPA funds, and then Douglas Farnham from the administration is here to go through some of the details. We thought it would be good to do a quick overview of just like what happened with all that money, why did we get it, where did it come from, what'd you do with it?
We got a lot of money thanks to Senator Leahy and the small state minimum. Just to remind people that we were very fortunate. We had the second most federal funds per capita. I think Wyoming was the only one that had more, and they have a lower population.
Yes. So, for the record, Emily Byrne from the Joint Fiscal Office. I can't remember if I said that or not.
That's
great. So the ARPA overview, and I will go pretty quick. Again, jump in and ask questions. Some of them I may defer to Douglas, or we can ask sort of after the fact. So the American Rescue Plan Act was passed by Congress in 2021. It was an economic stimulus bill, sort of in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. It allocated $350 billion to state and local governments. It was referred to the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds. And the acronym is a mouthful, so I don't know that I will ever say it again. But and of that $350 billion, Vermont received a little more than $1 billion. It provided a significant amount of money to the states, but it did have very specific rules on what it could be used for. It wasn't just here's a pot of money, go do whatever you want with it. It was very specific. And the bottom three were added sort of later in the process. And I believe they were added after the Vermont General Assembly actually appropriated everything. So the majority of the funds that were appropriated by the ARPA funds appropriated by the General Assembly sort of fit into these first couple categories. So there was allowable to replace revenue that was lost as a result of the pandemic, respond to the public health crisis and the economic impacts associated with the pandemic, provide premium pay for the essential workers that had to continue to work through the pandemic, and investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. That's primarily where the funds went in Vermont. So the General Assembly appropriated all of those funds primarily in the FY22 and the FY23 budgets. So all of the funds were appropriated through those two bills, and then there were some other bills that related to it. There's links to all of them. If you want to like really go in and read all of it, great. You can find them all here, but that's where most of the funds were appropriated. This chart was put together by my predecessor, but just gives kind of a high level overview of the categories of funding. Most of the funds were directed. So economic development, housing, broadband and IT infrastructure, climate action, clean water projects, and a little bit to administration, because administering $1 billion takes a lot of human power to make sure you follow all the federal rules and requirements. And those G sections at the bottom, that's what's in the Budget Act. So if you're going to go all the way to the back of the bill to the G section to find the sort of specific language around those appropriations.
And we created the G section, I think, right?
Yes.
That's we created it because it didn't fit. It was a whole new budget thing.
Whole new, and to sort of keep it separate in its own place. So this I think is where a lot of the meat is related to ARPA funds, and what's sort of most important for, I think, this committee to understand is that there were specific rules around the use of the funds and specific rules around the timing of how the funds had to be obligated and spent and whatnot. So there are very specific definitions around ARPA funds, and hopefully this will sort of clarify some of it. So the first sort of deadline line in the sand from the federal government was that the funds had to be obligated by 12/31/2024. So that was a couple weeks ago. And what obligated means is that the funds have to be committed through a grant or a contract, meaning something has actually been purchased or something has been ordered. Obligated is not the same as appropriated. So the General Assembly's role in this was to appropriate, thereby authorize the executive branch to do the work, right? So that was done through the FY22 and 23 budgets. And then it was up to the agencies and departments to do that sort of obligation work, get grants written, get contracts written, and start doing the work. The sort of next big deadline from the federal government is the funds have to be expended by 12/31/2026, which means that money actually has to leave the state, meaning go to the contractor who built the thing, or go to the sub-grantor who was going to execute the work on behalf of the state. So that money has to be, that check has to be cut by the end of 2026. So a little less than 2 years from now. And the work that we're paying them for has to be done, or rather, I guess the check doesn't necessarily, the work had to be done by 12/31/26. There's probably going to be a little bit of liquidation period. But those are the sort of big timelines. So currently all the ARPA funds awarded to Vermont, the 1.5 billion got appropriated, and it has all been obligated, right? It had to be obligated by the end of last calendar year, but they have not all been expended. So we're in that sort of period where we're liquidating those obligations. And if there was anything that was unobligated at the end of last calendar year, US Treasury would come in and say, thank you, you didn't obligate it, we're going to take that back. So we are at this point not in jeopardy of having Treasury recapture anything because it hasn't been obligated. When we get to the end of 2026, if anything hasn't been spent, then there's sort of another opportunity for Treasury to recapture.
And that was a big deal. We were concerned that we didn't want to give money back. And meeting that goal was a lot of hard work on the part of a lot of people, as you can imagine.
Yes.
So that's great.
I think from when I was in the executive branch when ARPA sort of first came into play, I will say it is a lot of work to spend money, particularly federal money, and particularly like the volume that came in. I think it's been a lot of work for agencies and departments and state partners to keep this money moving.
Rep. Giacomoni, Joe?
Yeah.
So the liability, the remaining liability could fall on our community partners or vendors, whomever got the grant. So it could be a challenge, and then it's hard to hire people in this climate, workforce challenges.
Possibly.
If they didn't spend it, they could be asked to return some, but not us. The liability is not on us.
Well, to the extent we as the state are the ones who received the grant, we would have to work with those partners to help figure out. And I think that's a good question for Doug in terms of how you can reallocate those obligations.
Just for clarification, Emily, the money that went directly to our cities and towns, their ARPA money that, because it was a separate bucket for some of that stuff. The state's no longer part of that. So if they didn't spend it right, or I assume they have the same kind of time guidelines that the state had, they were the ones that would have to return it, right?
But Lisa, I think I think that's correct. Yeah. I'm not as familiar with the funds that went directly to municipalities, but I believe that's correct.
Okay.
So to sort of keep moving and to sort of follow up on Representative Shai's point in terms of making sure that all of these funds got spent. In the FY 2024 budget, there was a provision related to reversion of these funds. And what that did was, to the extent the General Assembly was going to be out of session, right, between the end of May and 12/31/2024, there was going to have to be some work done to make sure that those obligations were being made and to ensure none of that recapture happened. So what was in the 2025 budget was some language that allowed the administration to revert any appropriations that weren't obligated by 12/31/2024 and to do some work to see what was unlikely to be spent by 12/31/2026, because you could release the obligation, have somebody get a subaward and have it be granted. But if it was unlikely that in the next 2 years, they were actually going to liquidate that sort of put it subject to recapture by the federal government 2 years from now. So in the fiscal 25 budget, those ARPA reversions, they're itemized here, right? The first 36 million was going to go to FEMA match and to support hazard mitigation, which is things like FEMA buyouts for individuals impacted by the recent flooding. $4 million to help with the sort of audit needs that are going to likely come down the road from receiving these funds. The next 30 million was directed to VHCB, and the next 25 million was directed to VHFA. So, and after the administration went through, and this is what Douglas is going to go through, after reviewing the ARPA appropriations, the likelihood of liquidating what was sort of remaining unobligated, the administration reverted about $26.4 million. So, and that just goes to that first thing on the waterfall. So part of the FEMA match was met through that reversions, and everything else, there wasn't ARPA funds available. I have got some questions, I'll just say, people asking how come there wasn't, that money didn't get to VHCB. And the sort of reality around that is that, the General Assembly had appropriated everything, right? All of it was appropriated. And the only way that VHCB or VHFA or the remaining FEMA match was going to be met if it was looking like that money wasn't going to be spent per its original intent. So the administration sort of kept with the original intent and only pulled back appropriations if it looked like it wasn't going to meet the original intent to meet that waterfall. Another thing that occurred is what's referred to as curing of ARPA funds, which is a sort of another way of saying sort of a swap for general funds. So one of the things that ARPA allowed was certain government programs that had to continue operating throughout the pandemic, like the Department of Corrections, the Department of Health, higher education. The state could use some ARPA funds through revenue replacement, I believe, allowability, could use the ARPA funds in lieu of general funds. So what happened in certain instances was the administration saw an area where there were ARPA funds appropriated, but it may be, there may be some timeline challenges. So I'll use wastewater projects, for example. So we've had lots of flooding that has sort of impacted the ability to get those jobs done in the sort of timeline that's been outlined. But the administration identified with some areas where they may need a few more months or a little bit more time to finish the projects. And rather than leave it as ARPA funds and potentially jeopardize the clawback, if you will, from the federal government, use this authority to do the sort of switching general funds for federal funds, did some of that switching and sort of took some of the original ARPA appropriations, and this was authority that was provided in the 25 Budget Act, and flipped them to general fund appropriations. So the little example that I have, right? So you have a wastewater ARPA project and you have general funds of the Department of Corrections that were during the sort of peak pandemic years. So from an accounting perspective, some of the general fund that the Department of Corrections spent during peak pandemic years was sort of flipped for federal funds. It freed up those general funds, and that general funds came over to this ARPA project. And the ARPA project, it's circular, right? Those federal funds went over to the Department of Corrections. So it was just a kind of a switch.
And because
make
it's
sure-
a general fund for the ARPA wastewater, we weren't subject to the timeline, the deadline.
Yes, it gives the state a little bit more flexibility to finish some projects. But that's all I have sort of at a high level thing. Want to make sure that Douglas has enough time to go through some of the details.
Right.
Probably answer questions better than I
That would
can.
be great. And Emily will be around this afternoon also when we're at training and can come back and talk about more of this and answer your questions for that. But this is just to get you started. Thank you, Emily.
Yeah.
Douglas, would you like to come on up?
Madam Chair.
Coming, it's nice to see you. We have a lot of new faces here, so I think we'll go around the room. David, start with you.
Good to see you, Dave Yakavoni, Lamoille, Washington District.
Kosanska, Essex County District, and they live in Burke.
Mike Nigro, Bennington, part of Health. Stevens, Washington, Chittenden District.
Jim Harrison, Route 11.
Robin Scheid from Middlebury.
Tiff Bloomley from Burlington.
Trevor Squirrel, Underhill and Jericho.
Wayne Rush, Franklin 5, Highgate, Franklin, Berkshire, and Richmond.
Mike Norwicky in the Wyndham Ford District, Putney and Dummerston.
Lynn Dickinson, St. Albans Town.
For the record, Douglas Farnham, Chief Recovery Officer for the state, primarily concerned with ARPA state fiscal recovery funds and the flood recovery efforts from 2023 and 2024. So yes, everything Emily said is accurate. I would say we've both been trying to walk the fine line. There are infinite rabbit holes with this funding and different descriptions. There was an interim final rule that was in effect when the state legislature was designing most of these programs. Then there was a final rule that was passed kind of partway through that. Then Treasury put out an obligations interim final rule to talk about what obligations were, but not finalize it because they said, when we asked them, are you going to finalize it? They said, no, it's going to stay interim. And then, of course, dozens and dozens of FAQs to add color to various little areas. For the local fiscal recovery fund, speaking briefly to Rep. Harrison's question from before, yes, the state acted mostly as a payment processor to get $180 million to the towns, but the awards are directly to the towns from the Treasury. The vast majority, so I think everybody but maybe Burlington and South Burlington, maybe just Burlington, is an annual filer for the feds. So they have to file their reports in April. And the Vermont League of Cities and Towns has been assisting the towns with that work through an ARPA grant that the legislature approved for that work I think in the 2021 session. Set up that technical assistance, that centralized support from the beginning. And so almost every town in Vermont went with the revenue loss category because Treasury allowed up to 10 million of your funding, regardless of the size of your unit or your actual revenue, to be categorized as revenue loss, meaning a town that got 228,000, I think that's what Greensboro got, they could categorize every dollar that they received as lost revenue. And then they could apply that to almost any government purpose except for debt relief and pensions and certain one or two federal programs said, no, you can't use it as match for our programs like Medicaid. We can't use it for Medicaid match. So, but other than that, very broad uses and with less uniform guidance, less requirements, less administrative costs to spend that money. And that's one big reason we leverage the revenue loss category.
So they're not going to be on the hook for liability is what I'm hearing. If they all did the revenue loss, then they're okay.
The last time I spoke with Katie Buckley at the Vermont League, they had been actively supporting. They believed every town was in a good position. They were really encouraging those. There were a couple towns that even in December were still making some actions, but so was the state. And I think they should all be in a good position. There shouldn't be any money going back unless there was an administrative error somewhere. You never know until you get through the cycle. So I think we won't have a final picture until April. I know there's been a lot of confusion where, some towns have said, well, we didn't get this ARPA money or we had to send it back. And it was actually a state ARPA program that they were applying to. And they didn't get that money, but a different town got the award. So any of the towns that didn't get ARPA awards, those projects were all reallocated. Those awards were all made to different towns. So the primary action that took place in December, and Emily described, there were two reasons, right? If they didn't have the funds obligated, and that was usually because the program was coming to an end. Some of the programs created in 2021 and 2022 were more short-term and were more intended to, run their course over a year or two. Others were designed to run through 2026. So there was a broad gamut. There was a fair number of them that were smaller and they had run their course and they were reverted. You can see we have all of the ARPA programs listed out on the spreadsheet that we sent. That
you could just go across the top so people become familiar with what they're looking at here.
Right. So on the left, we start from the citation, to give you an idea of what act, what year, if you want to look up the exact language for that program. The category And of course, apologies, I don't think our categories always line up with the way Treasury categorizes it, the way the administration categorizes it, and the way the legislature and joint fiscal categorize it they're minor shades of difference, but they're largely similar. The agency is next. The DEPT ID is mostly for joint fiscal. If they need to find that money in vision, that allows them to do that. It's important to note that even when we're taking these actions to cure the ARPA and make it general funds, we retain that spending authority under the original DEPT IDs so that people wouldn't have to piece together two different items in the system. So the DEPT ID is the same one that these programs all started out with and has been retained over the course of multiple years and will be retained in vision so that we can always go back and audit this later and understand what's happening. If it changed from year to year, as some programs do, that would be very, very difficult to figure out.
We have a question, Rep. Stevens.
Thank you for this list. One thing I'm curious about is it doesn't have date. I mean, I guess it does during the 2022 Act of 182 of when they, on the far left-hand corner, but that represents when these were obligated. Is that right?
So this represents when it was appropriated in law, which doesn't, for Treasury's purposes, because some states, the executive branch directly just started running the grant. In other states, it was appropriated, like in Vermont, it was roughly 50-50. Treasury doesn't recognize appropriation as an action related to a federal grant. It's an interim step from their perspective. So the date that it was appropriated matters for us, but not for the US Treasury.
I'm just trying to get an idea of like how long ago some of these were, I recognize some of these from several years ago. And I guess I'll have to work on translating the expended, how it was expended. I was just trying to get an idea of like, do we know how long this money has been out there for any purpose? With the promise of it being expended by 2026, that's all.
So some of that will come as we go. Let's keep going across the top, and some of that maybe can slightly more clear.
We have an appropriation description next, which tries to get at the program title, but a lot of these are, much more nuanced and complicated than we can capture in the short language. So we do our best, but it's not great. In some cases, there's one line entry and there were 5 or 6 programs that were created underneath that appropriation. So it doesn't always line up. And sometimes we do have to dig in to understand that better with the department or program that was running it. The original state fiscal recovery appropriation is next, of course. And then, so that, if you look down to the bottom, that adds up to the 1.049 billion. If you sum up all of these rows, that is the full scope of the ARPA award. Now there is a $42,000 difference in what was appropriated and what was awarded. So we, being the state of Vermont, slightly over appropriated by 42,000. That's not a problem at all, really, because we'll handle that in the final reconciliations. Better to be a little bit over than to be under.
That was pretty close.
The next column is the SFR revenue loss category. So this is a category that was published by Treasury after the initial decisions were made by the Vermont legislature. And it's an expenditure category, but it has its own column, unlike all of the other expenditure categories, because it has those different rules, those lighter rule sets. Now, we had needed to apply the revenue loss characterization mostly to the climate action section of the ARPA package. And that's because the rule did not have anything in it about climate action. So any climate program had to be justified through some other means. And for many of those programs, there was no other way to justify the program under the federal rule. And we had to use revenue loss. The weatherization programs, if they were a low income weatherization program, we used low income qualification as a benefit. But a big chunk, at least half of our weatherization dollars went to above the Treasury thresholds for low income. And their definitions of low and moderate income were, of course, unique. and didn't line up with ours. So that's one reason we had to apply revenue loss. We did see that most of those revenue loss programs were very far behind on expenditures. And so the vast majority of that revenue loss capacity at this point has been cured to general fund. Because there wasn't really, once we figured out the mechanism and figured out how we could safely do the curing, there wasn't really a downside or a reason to hold off on curing those funds, particularly with an administrative change at the federal level. Don't want to get in trouble with my boss about what I say here. We don't know how a new administration will behave whenever they come in. And there have been efforts at the federal level to recapture ARPA in the past. And so having that money safely expended means it's no longer on the table. It's no longer part of the discussion. So that's, and then the next column is the reverted funds column. So this column you'll see doesn't affect nearly that many programs. It's scattered throughout the 12 pages. Fortunately, so with this format, if you wanted to look at just the reversions, you need to take the original spreadsheet and sort it so that they're all next to each other. But those reversions add up to 26.4 million. And they were, again, most of the programs had run their course. They had leftovers. They or were not able to launch significant phases. But a lot of the dollars did end up coming from the weatherization programs that, as of September 30th, had not spent any money. And when AOA looked at it, we said, there's significant risk that these programs won't be able to spend the money. It's been 2 years out of 4 and no dollars are spent. And so we did have a lot of back and forth with those programs and arrived at, just like any compromise, nobody's perfectly happy with it, but we arrived at a reasonable reversion to represent reducing the risk and trying to align that program with finishing by 12/31/2026. So that reversion column is where a program was actually reduced by the agency. And in all but 2 cases, those programs had run their course and there was no significant discussion about how much money really needed to come back to the.
They're all, there's some narrative explanation on the right for each of those.
Yes.
And that's how we got to the 26 million. We knew a lot more in December than we knew in April when we were guessing on that contingent list.
Yes, in April, they hadn't spent money, but they still had all summer to get things moving. And before, after testimony, I always told the programs throughout the course of 2024, you need to start spending money or we're going to have a difficult conversation in the fall. And so, but I think we did arrive at a place that let us reduce the risk and protect Vermont. And most importantly, clear this first gate cleanly. The next column is the waterfall for hazard mitigation. That essentially just adds up to exactly the amount that was reverted. That could have been up to 36 million if we had identified sufficient reversions. The composition of that number was based on an estimate of $7 million of additional need for state match for the Capitol complex and other state direct damage, and then 29 million for hazard mitigation. And that 29 million was based on some need for federal match and some desire to have hazard mitigation dollars that could support projects that don't meet the federal rules. FEMA's rules are very strict and in some cases don't make any sense to us. So that 26.4 million is 2.6 million short of the estimated portion that was intended for hazard mitigation. And so all of the federal match we currently need for hazard mitigation is met. We're not in the red as far as hazard mitigation match. We are short as far as state match goes, but we do have $30 million in an appropriation. We haven't spent very much of it, and that will take some time to spend on the state projects. We're still working with FEMA on the Capitol complex, what that project exactly will look like. And that's a huge factor in how much match we'll need.
And when you talk about hazard mitigation, this, if I'm understanding correctly, this is related to the floods of 23 and 24, and this is buyouts,
Yes,
homes, and maybe raising them or doing other kind of things to make them so they won't have the same experience with the future flooding, any future flooding.
yes. Over $300 million of project applications were received for the $100 million hazard mitigation grant we have. Of the projects we're moving forward with, more than half right now are buyouts. We're prioritizing buyouts because we need to get people out of harm's way. And right behind buyouts is floodplain restoration, anything we can do to reduce risk to those population centers.
Thank you.
And elevations are great when they work in Vermont. They're very challenging, unfortunately, to pull off in Vermont with our climate. And the fact that most of our flood risk is actually fluvial erosion, the rushing water floods are a higher risk than inundation flooding in Vermont because of our topography. So elevations don't work with those because you elevate it, you make it less stable, the house gets knocked down. That doesn't help anybody. Sorry.
I'm going to pause you. We need we'll give you, we have to have a hard stop at 10:30. Apparently training has started early and we have dispensation to be done at 10:30 instead of running up for training right now. So if we can at least get across here and
Yes.
we'll get you back.
All right. Apologies, Madam Chair.
That's not you. We're all running late.
So the next column, cured to general fund, and I'm happy to come back, talk more deeply about what that means. But essentially, if it was cured for general fund, it was a 1-for-1 swap. We did not reduce the money in that program at all. We just changed the nature of the money for that program. And then so the net ARPA appropriation is how much SFR money is still left in that program, because often we left a blend. What we tried to do was reduce the risk by curing a portion based on a conversation with that program of how much they needed cured in order to reduce their risk. The obligated as of 9/30 and obligated as of September 30th are informational. We're currently compiling the 12/31/2024 report, and we'll be filing that at the end of January. And we do anticipate having over 880 million expended on that report.
Wow.
So going from 544 million to over 880 million in one quarter.
That's a lot of work.
So that's the primary drive of what we tried to do in December was get our expenditure number higher, reduce our risk, and preserve as much as possible of the original legislative intent.
And that's perfect. So congratulations on getting all the money out the door, meeting the first deadline. That is huge for all of us. So we all benefit. And so if you're filing at the end of January, then that would be a time when you're done with that. You could come back and talk maybe more about that, or more about the flood. I think we had that on our list, didn't we, Aaron, for some conversation? And having the updated 12/31 would be great to see that number.
So
So we, thank you very